When I first started covering the industry 10 years ago, my sense of oil and gas discoveries was sort of what I had seen in the movies. You know, the gusher going up and people dancing, you know, There Will Be Blood or James Dean and Giant. It took me a little while to realize that that's sort of the exception to the rule. And the real history of petroleum exploration is not the wildcatters drilling a well off somewhere and getting lucky. It's drilling a well and forcing your will onto the rocks, making the rocks do what you want, cracking them, fracking them. And I was really amazed to discover that back in the 1860s, just a few years after the first well, the famous Drake well was drilled in western Pennsylvania, that this whole business of creating fractures in the wells began. And it starts with Colonel Roberts, Edward Roberts, who was, the story as he tells it, he was in the Civil War, he was a colonel for the Union, and he got in trouble for being drunk on dress parade, and he was waiting for his court-martial. And of course, they needed troops, they were fighting the war at the time. So right in the middle of this, they said, well, we haven't come up with a decision what we're going to do with you yet, so in the meantime, go to Fredericksburg. So he takes his troops to Fredericksburg. And the Battle of Fredericksburg was an incredibly bloody battle, especially for the Union. The Union was in the low area, the Confederate troops were in a high area, and they were raining shells down on the Union. So Colonel Roberts was sitting there, he was trapped, and he noticed that when shells fell onto ground, they exploded in one way. But when they fell into this ditch with water, the weight of the water would tamp down the explosion, and the explosion would tend to go out. And he thought to himself, this could actually have some real implications. So after the Battle of Fredericksburg, he actually is court-martialed. He leaves the military, and he goes out to western Pennsylvania. And he convinces people that this new drilling that's going on, if they would just put one of his torpedoes, he called them torpedoes, down at the bottom of a well, fill it up with water, and then activate the torpedo, it would create a fracture. Because back then, if you drilled a well, you could come inches away from an oil seam, and it would be a dry well. But if you explode this bomb at the bottom of a well, you would create these new fractures, and maybe it would hit an oil seam. And lo and behold, he starts doing this, and as it turns out, this is incredibly successful. And even though everyone remembers Colonel Drake, who drilled the first well, Colonel Drake ends up penniless, pretty much living on the streets of New York before he's given a stipend from the state of Pennsylvania. Colonel Roberts, who invents the torpedo, ends up one of the richest men in the United States. Partially by suing anyone who tried to copy his invention. So the history of sort of man's dominion over rock, trying to drill a well but then do something with a rock, goes back to the beginning. And then you have this middle period, really right about 1901, Spindletop's discovered in Texas. That's the era of the gusher. But there are not that many giant wells where you can just sink a well, giant oil reservoir, where you can sink a well and the oil comes flying up. And right about the middle of the century, you still have some wildcatters. They're mostly gathered around Houston, but you have this interesting gentleman named George Mitchell, son of Greek immigrants, and he is one of the first wildcatters, so to speak, who's no longer going to just try to go off and find the oil. He is more interested in figuring out, can we use modern science to make better wells? And he learns about fracking, because at this time fracking's starting to come back, the big giant gushers are gone, and he leases a bunch of land north of Fort Worth and is making good wells and is doing an early stage of fracking at that time, much smaller than what we have today, and is making these wells work. But each time he drills down there, he realizes that underlaying the oil reservoir he's shooting for is another rock, very dense, shale rock, and the tools show gas. Each time you go in there, there's gas that's being shown. So he, for 16 years, from 1982 to 1998, says to his company, go and try to figure out how to open up that shale, how to make a good well into that shale. It doesn't matter if you can't do it, or it's all right, we're just going to do us a few wells a year. And for 16 years, he plods along and basically has one failure after another. He's learning a little bit. Sometimes he gets a little oil and gas out. It's mostly gas up there. And then in 1998, one of his young engineers tries a new form of doing this, a lot more water, a lot more pressure, and it is by far and away the best well they've done in 16 years. And that turns the corner. So 1998, all of a sudden, the industry begins to figure out that they can use water with chemicals added to slicken it and lots of pressure to break open these incredibly dense shales. And so the final person really who changes fracking and makes fracking what we know today.
George Mitchell ends up a billionaire too.
George Mitchell, thank you. George Mitchell ends up a billionaire. He sells his company to Devon, does incredibly well. And I should mention, he's actually a fascinating character because he you don't think about this, you don't think a Houston oilman would be both liberal and an incredible adherent of sustainability, but he is. He falls under the sway of Buckminster Fuller. Basically, after he makes enough money, he's no longer scrapping by, his mind begins to wander. And he starts getting interested in all sorts of things. He funds sustainability studies at the National Academy of Sciences, and their Dennis Meadows, who writes Limits to Growth, one of the early books on that. So he's fascinated about that, but he never pursues renewable energy. He really believes natural gas is the right fuel. And then just to finish this off, so the industry figures out we can use fracking to get at some of this gas. And it's really about 2003, 2004 that an Oklahoma businessman named Aubrey Mcclendon, who's running Chesapeake Energy, adopts this. And his great contribution to this is money. He knows how to work Wall Street. And he goes to Wall Street and gets billions of dollars of funding and starts leasing up everything he can find above the shale. So he takes it from one shale in Fort Worth, and all of a sudden he leads the charge. And by the time he's done, about 2010, 2011, Chesapeake Energy owns or has leases to drill on land the size of Kentucky. And this is amazing because back when he starts in 2003, Chesapeake Energy was nothing. It was basically in bankruptcy. An incredible story. Doesn't make much money. It's constantly borrowing money to get bigger and bigger. I mean, this is a growth story. Mcclendon's sort of a fascinating character. He's very much a capitalist at heart, very much materialist. At one point, his wine collection ran to 70 pages. He actually got in trouble and had to use it to get a loan. So we know that his wine collection ran to 70 single-spaced pages. But he pushes, really the best way to describe him and what he did with the fracking revolution is he put his foot on the accelerator and mashed down. And the industry, which maybe was going at 30 or 40 miles an hour, in about 2005, 2006, 2007, starts going 80 or 90 miles an hour. Everyone's forced to catch up with him. And that's why, in some ways, this energy boom happened so quickly. Because he's got money coming in from Wall Street, they've got the technology in place, and they just go to town. And it's not just Chesapeake. There are about maybe a dozen companies that are caught in his slipstream and figure if we can't lease quickly, we've got to match him. Because if we don't, Chesapeake's going to lease this land and all the shale, and they're going to start doing it. And so that's really when we get to 2010, 2009, 2010, and people start talking about fracking, some of the environmental issues. By that point, the industry is going 80 miles an hour, leasing, moving as quickly as they can, and fracking every well that they have. And they have discovered shales. And shales will, when fracked, will provide oil and natural gas, depending on where you are, and there's just an abundance of energy available. People thought that the United States was tapped out. After 2006, 2007, that whole narrative changes. There's more energy than we frankly know what to do with right now.